people who've got the money to conduct trials are pharmaceutical companies. So their interest is in generating evidence of their products working. And so what you have is this irresistible force that's pushing all medicine towards prescribing, towards pharmacology. I'm not a Luddite. Drugs are brilliant for many situations, and the pharmaceutical industry has revolutionized many patients' lives. However, they do have a history of expanding the scope of conditions that their products should be prescribed in, creating conditions that doctors can then prescribe drugs in, which is leading to a lot of prescribing and medicalisation.
Welcome to Medicine Unheard. My name is Hamad, and this is where healthcare workers change conversations around health and care. In this episode, we're joined by Dr. Phil Whitaker. Phil is a GP by background with over 30 years of experience. He's also a medical commentator and editor at The New Statesman and has authored several books, including What is a Doctor? In this episode, we talk to Phil about the foundational features of good medicine, the beginnings of movements around patient-centered personalised care, the concepts of over-medicalisation, and the principal difference between evidence-based medicine versus evidence-dictated medicine. But first, let's start with the most central question of all. What is a doctor?
It was the question that was in my head probably back in about 2019, I would say. And it was a sort of dawning realisation. I think there was no moment of epiphany, but I qualified back in 1990. I qualified MRCGP back in 95. So I've been around a while. And the job that I'd love to do for all those years, sort of, probably going back about 6 years ago, something like that. It was starting to dawn on me that it was becoming ever more difficult to do that job. And I was kind of just trying to work out what was going on. And it kind of occurred to me actually that I've been, just through chance, I've been given a kind of ringside seat really in the two sort of big movements in medicine that had kind of taken place over the course of my career, both of which have had a part to play in this. And I've also seen sort of political changes and things going on too. So these things started to swirl away in my mind, and the book was the result, basically.
Brilliant. And, how would you, I guess, now define the term doctor? And have you seen that definition evolve over time across your career, across these many movements that you identify within medicine?
Yeah, this is such a difficult question. So I've been thinking about this a lot over the years. And there isn't any right answer. I mean, I probably could look in a dictionary and find some definition. But number one, I think what a doctor is has changed over the years, over the course of medical history. And there are lots of things that have brought about change. Not always medical things, but other things like culture and politics and economics and whatever else. But if I was going to try and answer the question, what is a doctor? I think I would say that a doctor is a professional who knows a shed load about medicine, basically. And I'll try and unpick that a little bit. So a professional, that's got lots of connotations, but they're basically somebody who, there's two things I think is important. Number one, there's somebody who, on the whole, we think of as being trustworthy to regulate themselves. So they don't need somebody hovering over them, checking they're doing the right thing. They don't have to fill in lots of boxes to say what they've been doing. They should be trustworthy to actually do a good job. So there's something about self-regulation in professionalism. I think slightly in tandem with that as well, professionals are generally people that we go to navigate life's grey areas. So it's all fine if you can just find the answer, using a Google search or just looking something up. But where there are lots of different facets to a situation and the territory is grey, then whether it's a doctor or it's a lawyer or some other sort of professional, teacher, for example. We go to them for their best take on how we should proceed. So there's something about self-regulation and trustworthiness. There's something about navigating grey areas. And then knowing a shed load about medicine, I've got to qualify that slightly, because I think you've got to know a shed load about medicine appropriate to the role that you're doing. So I'm a GP, general medical practitioner, so I need to know a good amount across the whole sweep of medicine. I can then deal with the vast bulk of problems that patients bring to me, but I've also got to kind of know when I don't know enough and where they need connecting with a specialist. And a specialist has got to know a shed load about their particular field in medicine, but they may not know anything very much that they can, apart from what they can dimly remember from medical school, about other areas. So different doctors have got different sort of knowledge bases and knowledge levels, but they've got to be expert in what they're trying to do, so that a patient can have confidence that they're getting up-to-date, authoritative kind of advice and treatment from that professional. So it's a long way around, but a professional who knows a shed load about medicine, that's my definition.
I love that. Brilliant. And can you share a bit perhaps about the historical evolution of the medical profession, as you've discussed in your book, but more particularly perhaps answering to the question, in your experience and in your time, what do you think has been the biggest movement within modern healthcare and medicine, good or bad?
Yeah, well, I think within medicine there are two, basically, and both of them are good, actually. But like everything in life, they're not kind of one-sided coins. So basically, I trained in general practice in the early 1990s, and evolving them was a movement that we might call sort of patient-centered medicine. And for much of medical history, a doctor perhaps adopted what might be called a paternalistic role. A patient would go along, they wouldn't really know very much about health or anything that might be going on. They would go to the doctor would listen, ask them some questions, possibly make some eye contact, but that wasn't obligatory. It would tell them at the end of the consultation what the trouble was, what they ought to do about it, and the patient would go out tugging their forelock, very grateful. And that was really changing. Now, it didn't just change in the early 1990s. That's been an evolution for a couple of decades before then. But that patient-centered movement was really gaining a head of steam then. And it was a real change. It was the idea that instead of that sort of expert and grateful layperson relationship, the doctor-patient relationship was more of a partnership between two experts. The doctor being the expert in medicine, the patient being the expert in themselves. And the doctor becoming more a sort of medical ally or an expert ally, helping the patient to navigate forward. And in order to do that, they needed to engage with that person as an individual, work out what kind of things were important to them, what kind of things impacted on their health, not just the biological, but the psychosocial as well. And I was very fortunate. My trainer when I was a GP registrar was a guy called Peter Tate, who was one of the leading lights of patient-centered medicine. Anybody medically qualified listening to this podcast will know about ICE, Ideas, Concerns and Expectations. Some will love it, some will loathe it. For those who loathe it, it was Peter Tate who was responsible. That was his brainchild. And so I kind of was right on a ringside seat to Peter's influence in encouraging doctors to think about their patients' own ideas, concerns and expectations just as much as the medical biology of what might be going on. So that was a movement that was getting that great head of steam. And in parallel was this other movement which we started out calling evidence-based medicine. And broadly speaking, the idea of that was just like loads of research going on around the world, looking into what's the best kind of treatment for certain conditions and problems. And evidence-based medicine was bringing that evidence right into the consulting room or at the bedside to inform the care of a patient in front of you. And again, that was something which I had a bit of a ringside seat on. So a guy called David Sackett was headhunted back in the mid-1990s, came to Oxford and set up the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. That was the first such institution in this country. And I was one of the first people he gave a lecture to when I was a GP registrar. So I saw evidence-based medicine being born in the UK. I think it's a brilliant idea. I think it's an idea that's been horrendously corrupted and is very corrosive and is destroying much of what I believe in with patient-centered medicine. We can talk more about that possibly. But yeah, those are the two big medical movements that I'm kind of dealing with in the book.
It's really interesting just hearing on the second part as well, talking about evidence-based medicine and how necessary we would consider empiricism and following guidelines and following, evidence to be a cornerstone of good medical practice. But you touch on, like you said, this sort of perversion, this distortion, and seemingly now corrosive nature. Maybe it'll be interesting to talk about that. You talk about evidence-based medicine versus its now sort of child or evidence-dictated medicine. And how did we get to the latter, and what is the issue?
Yeah, so I mean that's my kind of term, evidence-dictated medicine. And how did we get there? It's probably a kind of unholy child of both evidence-based medicine, the idea that we can bring in scientific evidence to inform clinical decision making, alongside some other kind of ideas that perhaps I was talking about professionals being trustworthy to regulate themselves, but I think over the course of my career we've seen a kind of a developing picture from the centre politically that maybe that's not something that our leaders believe in. They think that there's one way of doing something, and actually they can kind of roll that out nationwide in the form of guidelines and protocols, and compel people to follow those ideas. That kind of arose out of what was a healthy movement, which was started out by things like the Cochrane collaboration, publications like Bandolier, that used to basically recognise that a jobbing doctor in any specialty couldn't hope to keep abreast of all the research and developments in any particular field. So things like the Cochrane collaboration would pull together international experts. They would look at all the evidence around. They would produce a kind of distillation, a summary, and that would be made available to people to look at and bring into the consultation. And that was a good thing, but it sort of morphed both, first of all, through something called National Service Frameworks, which was the centre of NHS sort of saying this is what doctors should be doing. But even more coercively, I would say, when something called Quality and Outcome Framework, or QOF, in general practice came along, doctors' behaviour started to be highly incentivised through financial incentives and penalised if doctors didn't conform to what the guidelines were saying. So we've kind of got this culture now where doctors increasingly sort of feel like they've got to adhere to guidelines, to QOF dictates, and if they don't, if they do, they're going to be rewarded, and if they don't, they're going to get in trouble. And I think really important point to make is, I mean, evidence-based medicine, or even evidence-dictated medicine, sounds like the kind of thing you'd say, well, what's the problem with that? It's evidence, and if it guides or dictates your practice, surely that's good. But really, really important is what people need to understand is what's the nature of evidence. So basically, you get the evidence you pay for, and creating medical evidence is expensive. Clinical trials take a lot of money to conduct. And the people who've got the money to conduct trials are pharmaceutical companies. So their interest is in generating evidence of their products working, broadly speaking. And so what you have is this irresistible force that's pushing all medicine towards prescribing, towards pharmacology. Now, I'm not a Luddite. Drugs are brilliant for many situations, and the pharmaceutical industry has revolutionized many patients' lives. I completely get that. However, they do also want to sell an awful lot of their products, and they do have a history of expanding the scope of conditions that their products should be prescribed in. They've got a history of creating conditions that doctors can then prescribe drugs in, so which is leading to a lot of prescribing and medicalisation. And the evidence dictation pushes doctors down that kind of pathway, which is not always what patients want to do, or is indeed the best thing for patients. So rather than evidence-based practice, doctors are increasingly dictated and dictating to patients about taking drugs, often I would say without informed consent, which I think is a big problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's so much there to unpack about clinical culture, over-medicalisation, and that's a huge conversation to tap into. I just want to take a step back to what you previously said about the concept of patient-centred care, and Peter Tate, talking about ICE, ideas, concerns, expectations, resolving the typical paternalistic sort of culture that we typically had. Currently, I would say the doctor-patient relationship hasn't been more damaged in recent times than before. I mean, public satisfaction with the NHS has reached record lows. I think around 24% of respondents expressing satisfaction, and record low since records began since 1983, I believe. What do you think is contributing towards that patient dissatisfaction? Of course, there's external factors. And what do you think, as doctors, healthcare workers, we can do to improve that patient-doctor relationship? Part of it is patient-centered care, absolutely. But is there something else that we're missing?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, as you're hinting at there, that's a massively complicated question, which brings in levels of funding and all sorts of different questions that maybe we don't really want to go to today. But within medical culture, I think there are some important things. So patient-centeredness, and that's often in tension with guidelines and with evidence dictation, as we've talked about. But it is more than that as well. And I think this is true certainly in general practice, but I also think in hospital medicine too. And it's something that I write about in the book, which is this notion of responsibility. So in general practice, for example, when I started out, it was very, very common for a GP to hold a list of patients, and by and large, patients would come and see their doctor. Doctors couldn't be available all the time, so sometimes they would see other people, but on the whole, you had a doctor, a GP who was your doctor. They kind of had responsibility for you. If you had a problem and you ordered some investigations to try and look into it, you'd get that patient back. You'd pick up the story. They would have felt that you were owning their problem, working with them. And by the way, responsibility is not about taking responsibility away from patients. Absolutely not. But remaining present and keeping that patient's case as part of your concern. And that was true also in hospital medicine as well. People would be under a consultant. Yeah, of course, they had teams, registrars, senior registrars, but they would know their consultant who they were under. And I think in both sort of primary and secondary care, we've lost that connection, that responsibility. So in general practice, increasingly, a doctor will have a consultation with a patient, maybe make a plan, and we'll cast them back off into the void. And we'll sort of say, look, hey, if you need to come back, good luck. And then wouldn't obviously say that, but and then next time they come, they're as likely to land up with a different doctor who's got to start from scratch, maybe has a different take on things. It gets really dispiriting for patients. They don't feel that they've got anybody who's taking care of them. And we see that in hospital medicine too, where instead of me getting to know consultants, perhaps referring somebody to Mr. Smith, the orthopedic consultant, and they would stay under Mr. Smith's care, I just write a generic letter to the orthopedic people. They kind of go in under the person with the shortest waiting list, and maybe next time in clinic they come under a different consultant's team. So lots and lots of different facets, but I think the underlying theme is that lack of care, that lack of continuity of care. And patients really, really miss that. I think they don't feel cared about. I think they don't feel that there's anybody actually walking that journey with them. And I think that's a really big problem. There are lots of others as well. I mean, we can talk about the general busyness of the service and the lack of numbers and things too. But, continuity care is only possible when you've got a manageable patient workload. And that's one of the difficulties there.
Anne Boyer writes in her book, The Undying, speaking from her experience of like a cancer diagnosis, she's written it so succinctly that describing the sort of industrial atomization of the patient journey. You walk into a hospital, you've got the nephrology unit, neurology unit, cardiology unit, respiratory unit, ad infinitum almost, and you've got these hyper specialist, incredibly vital, important healthcare professionals who are looking from a very clinical gaze, and you lose sight inevitably from the patient. And I think that's a really interesting development in the modernization of healthcare, in tandem of, yes, it has delivered incredible advantages. Hospitals and fast access to care is incredibly important. You actually call it martini medicine, I believe, in your book as well. This constant access of almost medicine everywhere, everything all at once, sort of idea of that. But just going back on the patient relationship and the fact that we see, or patients are feeling, this industrial atomization. In your view, what are then the essential foundational elements of a successful doctor-patient relationship?
Yeah, well, I think it's continuity. So I absolutely accept you can't always see the same person. The world isn't like that, but you need to, as a patient, have a continuing relationship with a doctor. You touch upon that hyper-specialization, subspecialization in secondary care, which is an important factor, and I think makes it ever more important that a patient has continuity with a really well-trained GP, because the GP, one of our many roles is as a kind of medical care manager, if you like. We sit at the centre. We can take opinions from half a dozen consultants in hospital, all of them working in their particular area of expertise. But we can synthesize all of that going on with a patient in front of us if they've got that kind of relationship with us and that continuity. So there's got to be continuity. And I think in this era, definitely there has to be that allyship, that kind of partners of experts. So, the doctor as your expert ally, certainly the GP as your expert ally. Patients, absolutely rightly these days, have got a huge amount of access to medical information. Culturally, we are very much wanting to be in charge of our healthcare and our if we're unwell, we want to be in the know, and that idea of no decision about me without me. If a patient has a doctor who's respecting that and honouring that in the consultations that they have, I think those are the foundational elements there. And I think with the atomization in secondary care, which I think it is inevitable given how sort of much detailed scientific knowledge there is in every field. It's ever more important that patients have that linchpin in general practice in primary care. And I mean, the history of the NHS is it's often sort of written from a hospital perspective, and people often think of the NHS as essentially a hospital-based service, and GPs are somehow sort of kind of a slightly weird anachronism out there. But actually, I would say it tips on its head. So the NHS is in general practice, and we are it, and we're supported by our colleagues in secondary care. We recognise when we need their help and advice and input. We arrange that, and we continue to look after our patient through that journey. My kind of view of the NHS really should be that patients have got that relationship with the general practitioner. That's their go-to, their care manager, and our esteemed and fantastic consultant colleagues are there supporting us and our patients, not the other way around.
Really, really interesting. And, we're talking about the drivers of change in modern medicine. It would be amiss not to mention AI, artificial intelligence, the perils, the promises, the potentials of improving healthcare, in modernizing healthcare. One, how do you think technology has impacted the way in which doctors interact with their patients? And then two, is it promising? Is it just hype? Where is the place of AI in our healthcare?
Yeah, I'll tell you where it isn't. It isn't in replacing human doctors, for sure. Which is actually weirdly where we kind of slightly started out with this back in the era of a guy called Matt Hancock, who was a health secretary 6 or 7 ago, or maybe 5. And Matt Hancock was a sort of a Labrador of a politician. So he was waggy-tailed and enthusiastic about AI, and in particular a kind of app called GP at Hand that was produced by a company called Babylon Health. And Matt, bless his heart, knew absolutely nothing about medicine, and he got bamboozled and wowed and seduced by this app that appeared to be able to just do everything a doctor could, and wanted it rolled out across the NHS. So replacing people like me very, very cheaply. So got hugely excited about that. So that was kind of the first sort of salvo in the AI story. And really, that's just not where AI should be or will be, actually. AI is like a stethoscope. It's like a CT scan. It's like a full blood count. It's a tool, and it can really help us. So, I mean, where it fits in varies according to where you're sitting, but any area of medicine where you're chewing through a lot of data and you're looking for things that stick out. So whether you're looking at pathology samples, blood test results, computers are brilliant at churning through huge amounts and looking for patterns and pulling out stuff that doesn't fit. And they can kind of bring those up to human attention. So that those kind of areas will be fantastic for AI for sure. I think where AI absolutely falls flat on its face is in the human relationships that are absolutely at the heart of healthcare. We are so far away from AI being able to actually even draw information out of patients in a meaningful and sensible way. I mean, from time to time, people sort of run AI products against medical exams and sort of show that they can perform really well. But basically what they feed them is what we might call very distilled medical model material. But I promise you, if you gave an AI app some of the patients that trundle in to see me on a regular Monday morning, it just won't get that information because patients don't just dish up stuff that would be recognizable to a textbook or a guideline even. I understand so much about how people talk and don't talk about their health and what's worrying them and what's going on in their lives, all of which is incredibly important to understanding what's happening for them. AI is not going to replace me anytime soon. If you try it, it's going to fall flat on its face. But most definitely got a supporting role in the same way as lots of our other bits of technology. We don't even think about practicing medicine now without a stethoscope. Or without blood tests readily available. They give us information, they help us very much, and that's what AI will do.
I always think it's right there in the name. It's artificial intelligence. It's not the true standard of intelligence. And even studying neuroscience, you find that minds can be algorithmic, but algorithms cannot become minds. And in the most protracted moments of human suffering and vulnerability, as you would see in clinics, you have to rely on an incredible level of emotional intelligence, like you've just said, and you even touch on that in your book. Why do you think, or why is it crucial for doctors to cultivate this very higher level of emotional intelligence, and how can you cultivate it?
I mean, why it's important is basically because every illness, and I'm making a little distinction with using that term, but every illness is it's more than just a disease, and it's happening to a person. That person's got a history as long as their life. They've had innumerable past experiences. They've got a kind of they've got relationships. They've got responsibilities. They've got dependents. They've got dreams. They've got fears, and all of that conspires with a disease. Sometimes not even with a disease we can recognize, but to create an illness. And if you don't have emotional intelligence, you can't begin to really understand and make a proper diagnosis, or indeed resist a diagnosis. And actually, medicine has always been and will continue to be about more than just then, having reached a diagnosis, dispensing a treatment, whether that's a drug or an operation or a lifestyle advice or anything else. you need to work with a patient to tailor what's most appropriate to them as well. And again, that takes emotional intelligence. So yeah, every facet of what we do is a human. Medicine is a humanity. People sort of talk about, is it a science or an art? Well, it's a humanity basically. There's science in there, there's art in there, but there's humanity is right at the core of it. How do you cultivate it? I'm not sure. People vary in their level of emotional intelligence, their degree of empathy. I think medical schools have a big part to play in actually trying to bring into the profession people with those kind of qualities there. So that's kind of foundational. Training, I've been a GP trainer for about 15 years, so I work with my registrars just through cases and discussion, helping to develop their ability to understand what's going on under the surface and what's being said beneath the words. So training's there, and I think just as we go forward in life as well. I think a fantastic development in medicine over the course of my time has been graduate entry medical studies. So when I went to medical school, there were no GEM courses at all. Everybody went in, more or less from sixth form, maybe had a gap year. Very occasionally somebody might have done something else, but went in to a 5-year course. I think we've now got about 16, maybe more graduate entry courses that are bringing people with life experience. And, I'm a way better doctor than I was 20 years ago, just because I've lived a lot and had some stuff happen. So all of those stir into the mix. I don't think there's an easy answer to how to cultivate it, but those are the ingredients, I think.
Brilliant. And, in cultivating that emotional intelligence, I think there's this conversation to be had about tenderizing, your mind and your spirit when you're interfacing with a lot of suffering. This beautiful quote, I can't remember who quotes it. It's from Marianne Booker's book, Intervals. And she's quoting someone who says that, I suffer deprivation that is not of mine. I suffer of the hardships of my patients that is not of mine. How do you create that space to embody the depth of desperation, despair, dissatisfaction that you see in your patient in front of you, empathize with that, but then remove yourself from the emotional aspects of it and recognize that, you can be in a position to change? There's a lot of emotional burden, I think, that contributes to empathy burnout that we might see across our healthcare workers. How do you combat that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Foundational to that, number one, is a manageable workload and time. So that becomes ever harder if you are just busting through an unmanageable workload. So you've got to have time. There's a fantastic guy called Roger Neighbour in the GP world who wrote a book called The Inner Consultation, dividing up a general practice consultation, but this is true of any encounter with a doctor and a patient, into kind of 5 broad chunks. And the 5th was something called housekeeping. And he made the point that basically when the consultation's finished and the patient's gone out of the room or the doctor's left the bedside, there's something else to do, which is looking after yourself. And just recognizing actually that many interactions will create an emotional reaction in yourself. That could be happiness. You could have a patient come back and whatever it was you did has made a big difference, and you just think, yay, does happen. But it could be anger, it could be deep upset, but you've got to recognize the impact on yourself and then just have a little bit of time to decompress. People have got different ways of doing that, but just naming it, giving it a space, that's important. And yeah, none of us can function if we take on our patients' situations. We need to understand them. We need to empathize with them, use that empathy and that knowledge to the best of our ability to help that person. But then we have to say there is a line and I'm on this side of it. You're on that side of it. I'm here to help you to the best of my ability. I can't cross the line and take that on. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a task that all of us have to do. I think some doctors possibly cope by staying a long way back from that line, so they maybe don't engage with the patients in self-protective ways, which I understand. But I think patients sense that, and it certainly affects quality of care. So there is a sweet spot somewhere in the middle where you're able to engage at an emotional level, but not to be unduly affected or dragged down by that. And if you can hit the sweet spot, that's great. It's easier to hit at 9 in the morning than it is at 5:30 at night, for sure. And sometimes I find myself just sort of late on in the day. I just kind of, bit of that housekeeping is just to say, okay, I've got, the next patient coming in. This is like the 30th person I've dealt with today. I feel absolutely shattered, but I've got to just dig up a little bit more energy to try and do the same job as I did for the first people this morning. So yeah, it's a constant sort of dialogue, looking after yourself, just being aware that you need to be looked after.
I mean, I've been thinking about it for quite a while now, and I sort of realized that actually the NHS doesn't need empathetic doctors, we need compassionate doctors, and sort of drawing that differentiation between, yes, embody the empathy, but compassion is rather recognizing as healthcare workers, you're in the privileged position of actually enabling that action and change. So like you say, it's towing the line and stepping back from the line, saying that you're not embodying the stress that you're feeling, and that you can actually induce the change that patients want to see in their lives. But touching on that and inducing positive change, I wanted to move towards the changing landscape of medicine. And one of the ways in which doctors try to improve patients' lives is through medication. And as we've mentioned, we're seeing this sort of perversive culture of over-medicalizing, and that's not just you pinpointing it. It's, the Department of Health and Social Care who's actually said that around 10% of all medications are now classed as unnecessary, to the effect of £2 billion a year are wasted on these medications that didn't need to be manufactured, didn't need to be prescribed, and the patient didn't need to take. All the while, 1 in 5 hospital inpatients are there not because of a naturally occurring organic disease that they had the misfortune of harboring, but because of adverse drug reactions that we impose upon them in a sort of weird effort to try and help them, in that effort to induce positive change in their lives. How have you come across that? What do you think are the drivers of this over-medicalization, and how can we overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, 10% woeful underestimate, I'm quite sure. I'm sure that much more than 10% of the prescriptions dispensed in the UK are frankly unnecessary. So how do we get here? It's evidence-dictated medicine, the evidence being funded and therefore principally concerned with pharmaceutical intervention. It's that guideline culture that we were talking about, the dictation. So, the guideline suggests there are half a dozen drugs that ought to be deployed. And so half a dozen drugs get deployed. And then the patient moves on, as you said, to the next subspecialist who gets their guideline out for the other condition that they've got. And there are another 5 drugs that should be deployed. And so they're all deployed. And so polypharmacy builds up. It's also about the kind of, political culture that we've been in. So, essentially there's this tension between prevention of disease and illness through pharmaceuticals, or prevention through what we might call the socioeconomic determinants of health. And we've had political parties in power over the last 14 years in the UK to whom really anything fiddling around with socioeconomic determinants of health is political anathema. So they're much more comfortable with the idea that the health service should be preventing disease by prescribing drugs. And that's 14 years is a long time for that kind of culture to persist. So I think that's a big contribution too. And then, we all know that we have some patients who they're fully in there. There's a pill for every ill. Give me the drugs, doc. But actually, for every one of those, a completely unscientific study, but much more majority of my patients are very wary of drugs. If they're given clear, properly balanced information, will very often leave drugs and not take them up. So anyway, lots of different factors there. But yeah, we do have a big problem of over-medicalisation, over-treatment, polypharmacy, iatrogenic harm, it's a big agenda on everybody's mind, or not on everybody's minds, but on a lot of people's minds. So I think progress in that will happen. It is happening, and pretty vital.
I mean, coming to a close, this has been such an incredible and insightful conversation. Just first question to ask is, how did you develop this lens of criticality, or, externalizing yourself and looking at all of these movements within modern medicine, looking at how we're perhaps going against the central tenets of pre non nocere, first do no harm, and we're causing inadvertent harm, and we're disservicing the patients. And so where did this lens of criticality come from? And I mean that in the most positive way, to look at and to observe medicine as a profession and to provide your sort of commentary is incredibly vital. But where did it come from?
Good question. So, yeah, I can touch on a few things that I view as sort of touchstones. So, when I was at medical school, I was at Nottingham, and I hung around with some very independently minded medical students. But I also hung around with some students who were doing other kind of courses with more sociological perspective. So I kind of heard a lot of stuff from other disciplines that were minded to look at medicine perhaps critically, look at society critically. So there was that kind of influence. And then my trainer, Peter Tate, who I mentioned earlier, I remember being a registrar, and he handed me a book by a guy called Peter Schreberneck called Follies and Fallacies in Medicine. It's out of print now. I managed to track down a copy last year on ABE Books because it's such a brilliant text. And he was a great critic. He looked at all the stuff. There's nothing new under the sun, and all the things we've been talking about, Peter Schreberneck was writing about a generation ago. And somewhere along the line, somebody got me to read Ivan Illich's big takedown of the medical industrial complex as well. So yeah, I've kind of had those kind of influences and voices. And then I would kind of like to think I wouldn't be doing, I started sort of writing about medicine in the New Statesman 10 years ago, and I was just writing about really exciting advances and, interesting cases, fully anonymized, etc. But somewhere in the latter part of the last decade, I just started writing more and more critical stuff because these kind of changes that we've been talking about through this podcast were gathering momentum, and I was becoming increasingly unhappy and thinking, well, why am I? And bringing perhaps some of those kind of external viewpoints to bear on things. So yeah, if I can make any contribution to rethinking health, I would be really, really a great legacy to leave.
And, I speak from a current medical student, a future doctor. There seems to be uneasiness with the future generation of the health workforce, like you said, not just with the way in which medicine is being moved, but perhaps undermined. And there's a whole conversation to be had there. But I read your book, and it was quite hopeful as well to see someone in your position to observe things with that critical lens. What do you hope readers would take away from your book, What is a Doctor? And what's that message to the future health workforce, perhaps?
Yeah. I'm not sure whether necessarily comes through the book, but I would leave the thought about pendulums basically and how they swing. So, kind of when I was growing up, medicine was quite paternalistic. When I was training, particularly in general practice, there was this big swing of the pendulum more towards sort of patient-centered medicine. Somewhat dismaying and demoralizing, but that pendulum swung back very definitely over the last sort of decade towards much more transactional, much more mechanistic kind of practices we've talked about. But number one, the genie's out the bottle. I mean, there are plenty of people within the medical world who are resisting that and fighting back against that. Much more importantly, it's never going back with patients. We've got this fantastic era now where patients have got access to huge amounts of medical information they've never had in the history of mankind. And culturally, they are not, it's a slow process, but more and more patients are going to doctors expecting to be fully involved, to be equal partners in discussions, and you won't knock that back again. And so I don't think the pendulum will be allowed to stay where it is. I think there'll be people within medicine. There are people within medicine trying to push it back the other way. But I think patients will also give it a damn good shove. So that's my kind of that's why I'm hopeful, because I don't think anything's ever settled, and things will wax and wane. And we may have a while to go before the pendulum really shifts, but it will. And the kind of thing I kind of finish in the book on 4 R's. Okay, so but one of them is about rebalancing medicine away from the kind of hospital hyper specialist, just basically rebalancing, saying the generalist, the GP, the well-trained generalist doctor is really, really important, both to patients and to the health service functioning well. And that balance has been lost, so we need to get that back again. We just got to relocate public health much more in terms of the culture, the society, the economic circumstances, social and economic deprivation. We've got to be looking much more at that as a country. So we've got to kind of get public health back from the drug pushing kind of tendency we talked about. I think there's a sort of need to re-professionalize, so get away from this idea that NICE produced some guideline, I'm just a monkey that's grinding cranking the handle, churning out the pills that it says on there. We talked at the beginning, a professional is somebody who helps people navigate through grey areas. There ain't no bigger grey area than medicine. And there's no protocol can encapsulate that for an individual. So we've got to get that professionalism back. But the last thing is responsibility. And anybody, I'm so encouraged, but the movement that you're part of, the next generation is thinking really critically and determined to change things. And that's just so encouraging to me, because I see the pendulum having some more people giving it a hefty shove. But just please remember that responsibility. If you're seeing a patient and they're going to need following up, make it your job. Draw them in, take responsibility, work with them. That's not disempowering them, but it's going alongside them. And that will be more appreciated by your patients than pretty much anything else you can do.